BQ Prime. Now, India's Monetary Policy Committee is set to meet and announce its decision on Thursday this week. All economists polled by Bloomberg expect the MPC to continue to maintain a status quo. However, what makes this policy a little bit interesting is the uptick in inflation that we've seen last month and the fact that it's set to continue. In fact, Suvodeep Rakshit, senior economist at Kotak Institutional Equities, expects food inflation to drive up headline inflation to 6% in July and 7% in August. To share some more of his insights, we're joined by him today. Suvodeep, thank you so much for taking time out.
Thank you so much.
So, to begin with, I do want to know what's your broad expectation from the policy. I think you, like most others, would agree that the MPC is likely to maintain a status quo. But that's not to say that there's not a lot happening. Food inflation has been driving up headline inflation. That's expected to remain the case. So what's your reading?
I think that's the interesting bit, as you correctly pointed out, that food inflation has spiked up in the last month. So if you look at June print, it would have been at 4.8%, the headline inflation. And from there in July, it has spiked up to, I think, the estimated would be somewhere around 6.5%. We are currently at around 6.4%. So to that extent, I think there is clearly a risk on the upside in terms of the headline inflation, especially since it breaches the 6% mark. That means that the upper tolerance level for the band that the RBI targets, that has been breached. Now, the reason could be because of food inflation, while core inflation remains much more subdued. But at the same time, when you're looking from a policy perspective, if you're looking at inflation, you're hitting the 6% plus mark. August print would be closer to 7%. Because the food prices are continuing to rise. So to that extent, it's a period where the RBI would want to be as cautious as it can.
All right. So, delving a little bit more into food inflation dynamics, would it be correct to say that largely the uptick is expected from vegetable prices? Despite that, we have seen a rise across several other food items as well, cereals, for instance, pulses especially. Also, another interesting data point from your last research report to me was the very sharp uptick that's expected in vegetable prices. So you expect an uptick of nearly 25 to 30% in vegetable prices on an annual basis. Is that right?
So the way we track the vegetable prices, obviously there are multiple sources, right? There's the wholesale market, there's the Department of Consumer Affairs, National Horticulture Board, a host of indicators that we track on a high frequency basis. Obviously, when the survey happens for the Consumer Price Index, which is done by the NSO, that happens in select markets, then the time period when the survey is done, etc., could vary. The point is that the vegetable prices have been on the uptick, right? That's solely because of tomato prices. But at the same time, there are other, for example, brinjal, onion to some extent, which have started to register a significant increase in the inflation numbers. But then it is dominated by the tomato prices, and hence the double-digit inflation that you see in vegetables is something that could very well be possible. It's an estimate as of now. On 14th of August, when we get the number, we'll know how much the increase is. But all indications are that the vegetables is what is driving the inflation. Having said that, there's also cereals inflation, where rice being a dominant part of the basket, rice inflation has been increasing. To that extent, we've seen how the government has reacted in terms of proactively looking at the export side of things and ensuring that the domestic supply is adequate. So to that extent, I think food as a basket is increasing, and it's not just vegetables. Vegetables might be spiking significantly for this month, but over the last few months, we have seen milk prices, spices prices, we have seen cereal prices, meat, egg, fish. Those have continued to stay on the higher side. What has helped inflation through these past few months is that there was a very favorable base effect, which kind of pulled the inflation numbers lower. What going forward, that base effect also wanes. And along with that, you have price increases in select items. So that is what the food inflation scenario is.
All right. So, I do want to understand that, like you said, the rise is predominantly coming from vegetables. In vegetables, we've seen a sharper rise in tomatoes, while that is partly seasonal. This time around, we've seen these figures to be a lot more than we usually see, even at this time of the year. But I do want to understand when we're talking about higher food prices across, are the factors driving higher prices similar across food items?
Not necessarily. I mean, see, weather being one broad aspect, you can put a broad brushstroke around weather and say that weather is one of the reasons. But also, I think there are disruptions in terms of unseasonal rainfalls, etc., which again comes under the weather basket. I think for now it is mostly the weather pattern which is one of the main reasons. Tomato also has aspect in terms of how much a remuneration the farmers were getting and how much they actually with low remuneration, how much of incentive they had in sowing. Which obviously affects the tomato prices. But I think one point that we should note here is that when you're looking at tomato prices, which is spiking significantly and contributing to the vegetables inflation and then food inflation, hence headline inflation, one thing that we should notice that it is a transitory effect, because in another, let's say 60 days or time, you would see the new crop come in. Now, how much a price fall happens around that time, you will see. But the point is that there are weather patterns which are, which kind of are contributing to this kind of spike. Typically, as you rightly pointed out, this is the period where seasonally prices are on the higher side, and you get to see food inflation, vegetables inflation, pulses, etc., on the higher side. So to that extent, I think it's important to note that this should be transitory, but the degree of fall still remains a question.
Got it. Okay. So, you touched upon weather being a primary commonality that's been driving up food prices. So this time around, according to latest data, while sowing has exceeded what it was at the same time last year, rainfall has remained unequal across the country, with some parts still seeing lower rainfall while others have far exceeded rainfall levels. So, is that expected to take a toll on food prices going forward?
See, from the sowing the sowing data that we have, I think the rainfall has had a minimal impact in the sense that, other than pulses, most of the other crops have seen sowing on the higher side. To that extent, it helps in at least forming an opinion or view that, yes, food prices will come under some control going forward. But you never know how these weather patterns evolve, because if there are unseasonal rains beyond the monsoon, what impact it has on the harvest then, that remains still a question. And here we are talking about, let's say, something like an El Nino year, positive IODs, which typically means that, whether the chances of unseasonal rainfall increases or not. So to that extent, I think while the sowing data is encouraging for now, and I think that goes to address some concerns of whether food inflation will come off. I think in our numbers, at least, we are assuming that from third quarter onwards, we should have some normalization in the food prices, and hence food inflation should start falling. But still, that's the degree of uncertainty that we still have. That what kind of unseasonal weather patterns will we have post monsoon, and we'll see how that pans out.
All right. So, considering we've spoken at length about some of the upside risk to inflation forecasts from vegetable prices, food prices, would it be fair to say that you also expect the RBI to miss its forecast for Q2 for inflation? Do you see the RBI revising that figure upward?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is, I think, very little option, because the second quarter at least will be on the higher side. So they have to revise that. Even if they assume that the third quarter and the fourth quarter numbers will be falling, even then the second quarter number has to be revised up. And that, from the 5.1 for the full year that they have, they would have to revise their estimates on the higher side.
All right. Okay. So, moving on, what's your reading of other high frequency indicators? Has growth continued to remain resilient?
Yeah, I think growth is not a problem. And I mean, when you typically think about policy, you think about whether the concern on inflation is higher or the concern on growth is higher in a very simplistic way. I think it would be fair to say the concern on inflation now outweighs the concern on growth. So to that extent, growth has been panning out relatively well. I mean, there would be pockets where there could be some concerns. For example, if you look at company results, the earnings part and the kind of reporting that they're doing on, let's say, consumer durables, there could be some areas of concern. But overall, when you look at the growth profile, it would not be that it's that big a concern that the RBI needs to address immediately in this policy.
All right. Okay. Suvodeep, thank you so much. This was most helpful. We'll continue to look forward to your insights post policy.